"Move aside, girl," the Duke of Wexholt said, and did not raise his voice, for men who own the ground beneath 100 villages rarely need to. Down the barrel of his fowling piece the great stag stood trembling at the edge of the frozen mere, its breath smoking, its dark eye fixed not on the guns but on the slight figure who had stepped out of the beech shadow to stand square between the animal and its death. She did not move. Julian Hart, 9th Duke of Wexholt, had brought down running boar in the Carpathian passes and a charging bull elk in the fens of his own country, and in 11 years since the fever had taken his wife he had learned to feel very little that a man could put a name to. He felt something now, and he could not have said what it was. The girl was perhaps 22, in a gray stuff gown gone thin at the elbows and a shawl the color of ashes, her boots caked to the ankle in the black mud of the shallows. Her hair had come loose from its pins in the cold and hung in dark strands against a face pinked raw by the wind. She had put herself between the barrel and the beast with her arms not raised in fright, but held a little from her sides, as one steadies a nervous horse, and she was looking straight up the length of his gun into his eyes as though the gun were of no more account than a walking stick. "He has done nothing to you," she said. Behind the Duke a low murmur ran through the hunting party, that particular murmur of the well-born scenting sport of a different kind. Sir Roderick Vane laughed, short and delighted. Lady Aldous, mounted side-saddle upon a grey mare with a groom at the bridle, drew her furs closer and said, in the carrying voice of a woman who has never once been ignored, that the creature ought to be whipped back to whatever scullery it had crawled out of. The dog strained and whined at the handler's fist. Julian did not lower the gun, neither did he fire. "You are on Wexholt land," he said. "Everything upon it, four-legged and two, is mine to dispose of as I see fit, including you." "Then dispose of me," the girl said. "But you shall have to look at me while you do it, and I do not think you will. You have the look of a man who would rather not be seen deciding." It was insolence of a kind that ought to have ended in a switching and a dismissal, and every soul in that clearing knew it and waited for it. What none of them had reckoned with was the arithmetic of the Duke's own heart, which had gone very still. He was accustomed to being feared. Fear he understood. He had built his life within its walls as another man builds within stone. This girl was not afraid of him. She was afraid for the animal at her back, and the difference was so total, so foreign, that for a long moment he simply looked at her and forgot the weight of the gun in his hands. The stag shifted. Its great head came down and it blew out a long shuddering breath, and one delicate foreleg lifted and set down as though it too were waiting upon the Duke's decision. There was a rope burn worn raw across its flank, Julian saw now, an old cruelty from some poacher's snare it had torn itself free of, the wound crusted and weeping. It had come to the mere to drink and to die, and this girl in her ash-gray shawl had walked out of the trees to stand with it, so that it should not die alone if it must die at all. "Charlton," the Duke said. His head-keeper came forward, hat in hand. "Your Grace." "Take the dogs up, we are finished here." The keeper blinked. Behind them Sir Roderick's laughter died into an offended silence, and Lady Aldous' mare tossed its head as her hands tightened on the rein. "Wexholt," Sir Roderick began, "you cannot mean to let a servant girl—" "I mean," said the Duke, lowering the fowling piece at last and breaking it across his arm with a snap that carried clean across the ice, "to go into my dinner. You are all very welcome to follow me, or to remain here freezing in the company of a wounded stag and a stubborn kitchen maid. I confess I no longer greatly care which." He turned the grey gelding's head. Then over his shoulder, without quite knowing why he did it, he added, "The animal is not to be touched. See to it, Charlton. The snare took him. Let the snare be the last unkindness he suffers on my land." He did not look back at the girl. He was aware, in the queer arrested silence that followed him up the frozen ride toward the great grey pile of Wexholt Abbey rising against the winter sky, that he wanted very much to look back, and that this wanting was precisely why he would not. That evening, at the long table beneath the smoke-dark portraits of 8 dukes who had never in their lives declined a kill, Julian ate little and said less. His sister Ottilie, Lady Farringdon, who had come north to sit with him through the dead months, and to remind him at every opportunity that a man of 140 with no heir was a scandal walking, watched him over the rim of her glass. "They are saying," she observed, "that you were bested by a dairymaid." "Are they?" "Roderick Vane is saying it, which means the whole county will be saying it by Sunday, embroidered, that you stood down your own gun because a servant looked at you crossly." She set down the glass. "It will not do, Julian. You are already thought half a hermit and three-quarters mad. You cannot afford to be thought soft as well." "No," he agreed, "I imagine I cannot." But he was not thinking of Roderick Vane or of Sunday or of the county. He was thinking of a raw-cheeked girl saying, "You have the look of a man who would rather not be seen deciding," and of how no one, in 11 years, had told him a true thing to his face. He learned her name 3 days later, and he did not have to ask it, which mattered to him afterward, when he came to sift these small beginnings for their meaning. Charlton, the keeper, mentioned it in the course of his morning report, that the Carrow girl had been down to the mere twice more with a pail of bran mash and a rag, and that the Stag had let her near it, which no man on the estate had managed, and that the wound was cleaning under her hand. "Bold as a magpie, that one," Charlton said, with the grudging respect countrymen keep for anyone who has a way with a difficult animal. "Nell Carrow, old Simon Carrow's girl, the under-gardener as was, him that has the wasting sickness now and can't turn a spade. She does the dairy at the home farm and keeps house for her father besides. Not a soul to help her. I'd have turned her off the mere, but your grace said the beast wasn't to be touched, so I reckon the girl fell under the same order, in a manner of speaking." He paused. "Did I reckon right, your grace?" "You reckon right," Julian said. Nell Carrow, old Simon's girl. He knew the cottage, a low thatched thing at the far end of the walled garden, its one good window facing east so that the dying man might have the morning. He had ridden past it 1,000 times and never once seen the people who lived inside it, for that was the particular blindness of his rank. The world was full of hands that opened his gates and warmed his rooms and set his food before him, and he had never troubled to look up from his own grief long enough to see the faces the hands belonged to. He found, to his own considerable discomfort, that he could not now stop seeing this one. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself a good many things in those short dark days, riding the frozen rides of his own estate with the collar of his greatcoat turned up against a wind that came straight off the German Ocean and cut like a farrier's knife. He told himself that a duke does not think of a dairymaid, that grief had made him strange, that the whole absurd episode at the Mere had been a symptom of the general derangement his sister was always hinting at. And then, on the 4th day, he found himself turning the grey down toward the Mere quite deliberately, at the hour when Charlton had said the girl came, and he did not tell himself anything at all. She was there. She was crouched at the Stag's shoulder with a rag in one reddened hand, murmuring something low and steady, and the great animal that would have gutted a hound with one sweep of its antlers stood for her like a foundered plough-horse, its eye half closed. She heard the gelding's hooves on the frozen ground and rose, and when she saw who it was her chin came up in that same square way, ready for battle. "I have not touched him with anything but this rag, and I will thank you to remember you said yourself he wasn't to be harmed," she said, all in one breath, before he had so much as drawn rein. "Peace," Julian said, "I have not come to harm him." "Then why have you come?" It was, he reflected, a fair question, and one he had no answer to that he was willing to give. He looked at the Stag instead. The wound on its flank was indeed cleaner, the crusted horror of it softened to raw pink flesh that had begun, unmistakably, to knit. "You have done that," he said, "in 4 days. Bran and clean water and a body that will hold still and be spoken to kindly," she said. "It is not sorcery, your grace. It is only trouble taken. Most creatures mend if someone will take the trouble. Most people, too, I shouldn't wonder, though I've less occasion to test it." The wind moved in the bare beeches. Julian sat his horse and looked down at her, and she stood in the black mud and looked up at him, and neither of them said the obvious thing, which was that a duke and a dairymaid had no earthly business standing at the edge of a frozen mere discussing the mending of wounds. "Your father is ill," he said instead. The change in her was immediate, a shudder coming down. "My father is my own affair. He was in my grandfather's service and my father's and mine. That makes him something more than your own affair. It makes him mine. He is not a horse to be doctored because he is your Grace's property," she said, and there was a heat in it now, a real anger. "He is a man who gave 40 years to your gardens and is thanked for it with a cottage he'll die in and a girl's wage that won't buy him the wine the apothecary says might ease him. Do not speak to me of what is yours. You have never once in your life come down to that cottage. You did not know he lived until Charlton told you. I will thank your Grace not to discover a duty to us now, when it costs you nothing and eases only your own conscience." Silence. The stag lifted its head and looked between them with its great mild eyes. Julian was aware that he had been spoken to as no one had dared speak to him since he was a boy, that every word of it was true, and that the truth of it had gone into him like the north wind, clean through the good broadcloth of his coat and into some cold, neglected place beneath. "You are quite right," he said at last quietly. "Forgive me." He turned the gelding and rode away, and this time he did look back once from the top of the rise. She had already crouched again at the stag's shoulder, her ash-gray shawl a small, still point in all that iron-colored world, and the looking cost him something he could not name, and did not sleep off, and had not shed by morning. The wine was at the cottage door within the week, a dozen bottles of the good Madeira from his own cellar, and a hamper besides, and no note, for he had thought better of the note 3 times over and in the end sent none. He told himself it was for Simon Carew, who had served 3 dukes and deserved his ease. He did not tell himself it was so that a raw-cheeked girl in an ash-gray shawl might, just once, think of the Duke of Wexholt as something other than the cold man on the horse who had never troubled to look. She sent it back, all of it, the whole hamper, carried up to the Abbey by the carrier's boy with a message delivered word for word in the boy's frightened treble, that Miss Carew thanked his Grace and could not accept charity for which no honest work had been done, and that if his Grace wished her father to have wine, he might raise the dairy wage a shilling a week, and let the family keep its self-respect, which cost his Grace the same and them a great deal more. Ottilie, who happened to be crossing the hall when the hamper came back, laughed until she had to sit down upon the settle. "Oh, Julian," she said, wiping her eyes. "Oh, this is very good, sent back by a dairymaid with a lecture on the wage." She looked at her brother and something in his face sobered her. "Julian," she said more carefully, "you are not tell me you are not being a fool about a dairymaid." "I am raising the dairy wage a shilling a week," the Duke said. "Across the whole estate, not one family only, so that it cannot be called favor. See to it with Mr. Prewitt, would you?" And he went up the great stair to his own rooms and stood a long while at the window that looked east toward the walled garden and the low thatched cottage he had ridden past 10,000 times and never seen, and could not now, it seemed, stop seeing. The shilling on the dairy wage was the beginning of a season of small revolutions at Wexholt Abbey, and though Julian told himself and everyone else that the reforms had their root in sound management long neglected, he knew in the private country of his own heart where the root truly lay, and he watered it in secret and would not have dug it up for the world. The hard weather held into February, and the cottages at the edge of the estate suffered. Word came up to the Abbey. It came up because Julian had begun, for the first time in his tenure, to insist that such word be brought. That fever had got into the row of dwellings below the mill, and that 2 of the poorest families had neither coal nor broth nor anyone to nurse them, and that old widow Peel, whose roof he had mended in the autumn, had taken it worst of all and was not expected to see the week out. In the years of his grief Julian would have heard such news, if he heard it at all, as one hears the sound of rain on a window, a thing outside, regrettable, no concern of his. He heard it now differently. He rode down to the mill row himself, against the advice of his household, who thought a duke had no business breathing fever air in a laborer's cottage, and he found there, kneeling on the earthen floor beside Widow Peel's cot with a basin and a cloth, the last person and the only person he might have expected, Nell Caro. "You should not be here," she said, not looking up. "You will take the fever, and then the whole estate will have my hide for letting the Duke die in Sal Peel's cottage." "You are here," he pointed out. "I am nobody. It is a great difference. Nobody minds if I die." She wrung the cloth. "Hand me that jug if you mean to be useful, and if you do not mean to be useful, your grace, go home, for there is no room in here for a man to stand about being grand." He handed her the jug. And then, to the lasting astonishment of the Mill Row and the eventual scandal of the whole county, the Duke of Wexholt took off his greatcoat and rolled his sleeves and stayed, and did as he was told, and learned that night at the hands of a dairymaid how to sponge a fevered brow, and lift an old woman to drink and bank a fire so it would hold till morning. He was clumsy at it. He had never in his life done a single thing for another human body with his own hands. But he learned, because she taught him, sharply and without ceremony, as she taught a broken-mouthed horse, and by the gray of dawn Widow Peel's fever had broken, and the old woman opened her eyes and saw the Duke of Wexholt asleep sitting up in the one chair with his fine coat thrown over her for a blanket, and she thought she had died and gone somewhere very strange indeed. She did not die, nor did the others, for Nell had gone from cottage to cottage through that whole bitter fortnight, dosing and nursing and scolding the sick into living, and Julian, once he had seen it, could not unsee it, and he set the weight of his house behind her, coal from his own stores, broth from his own kitchens, the apothecary at his own charge, so that between the girl's hands and the Duke's purse the fever that should have carried off half the Mill Row carried off no one at all. The village noticed. Villages notice everything, and where in the winter they had spoken of their Duke as the cold man on the gray horse, they began, that February, to speak of him differently, and to speak of the Caro girl and the Duke in the same breath, in the careful sidelong way of country people who see a thing long before their betters will admit it is there. It was in those fever weeks that Julian came to know the new curate he had summoned from Cambridge, a mild, grave young man named Mr. Ellery, who had arrived in January to take up the long-empty school and living at Wexholt Magna, and who proved, once the fever came, to be made of better stuff than his mild face promised. Mr. Ellery did not flinch from the sick rooms. He came each day, and prayed with those who wished it and simply sat with those who did not, and he and Nell Caro fell into an easy working companionship over the cots of the dying that Julian watched with a feeling he was slow to identify and ashamed, when he identified it, to own. It was jealousy, plain and green, the first he had felt in his adult life. For Mr. Ellery was young and unmarried and near her own station, a gentleman of small fortune but respectable birth, exactly the sort of man a sensible dairymaid might look to and think, "There is a match I could make without disgracing anyone." And Nell was easy with him and laughed with him, and Julian rode home from the Mill Row one evening in a black temper he could not account for until he named it, and having named it, sat up half the night despising himself, for he had no more right to Nell Caro's laughter than he had to the moon, and less claim on it than an honest curate who could offer her a life in the light instead of a scandal in the dark. He said nothing of this to anyone, but he watched through the tale of the winter, and he saw that Nell treated Mr. Ellery with warmth and never once with the particular fierce attention she turned on the Duke, that terrible honest attention that spared him nothing. And he came to understand, slowly, that a person shows you they are indifferent to you by being pleasant, and that Nell Caro was never once merely pleasant to him, and that this was, though it cost her, the truest thing she had yet told him. Mr. Ellery, for his part, was no fool. He saw how the land lay between the Duke and the dairymaid within a week of the fever, and being a good man he stepped back from what he had perhaps half hoped for, and became instead the one person in the parish who would speak of the impossible thing without either mockery or horror. "It is not for me to counsel your grace on your own heart," the young man said to Julian once, carefully, as they walked back together from a burying, not Widow Peel's, she lived, but a laborer's taken by the fever before Nell reached him. "But I will say this, having watched her these weeks. That young woman is worth more than the whole of the county that would look down on her, and if a man were fortunate enough to be loved by her, and let the county's opinion weigh heavier than the love, he would be the poorer for it every day of his life, and would deserve to be. And then he had reddened, and begged the Duke's pardon for his presumption, and Julian had told him there was nothing to pardon, and had ridden home with the curate's words lodged warm and painful beneath his ribs. The fever passed. The first snowdrops came up along the south wall of the walled garden, and the light lengthened, and old Simon Carew, in the low cottage with the window facing east, took a turn for the better with the turning of the year and sat up in his chair, and asked to be wheeled out into the thin March sun to watch the rooks build. Julian came to know that cottage in those weeks as he came to know the Mill Row, for the excuse of the orchard served him, and the excuse of the wine that Nell would still not let him give outright, but grudgingly allowed him to bring as payment for the pruning he did among her father's trees. And he found, sitting by the old gardener's chair in the pale spring afternoons, a peace he had not known since he was a boy. It was the peace of being, for an hour or two, simply a man among people who did not fear him. And it was, though he would not name it so, the peace of the hearth, the ordinary domestic warmth that his rank and his grief had between them kept from him for the whole of his adult life, and that a dying gardener and a fierce daughter and a low-thatched room offered him freely, asking nothing, because they did not know how to withhold it and would not have withheld it if they had. He did not know in those bright early weeks that his sister had been writing letters. He did not know that Ottilie, watching him ride out day after day toward the home farm, had grown alarmed, and had made her inquiries, and had settled upon Lady Sybil Aldous as the answer to a problem she had not yet admitted to her brother she perceived. He did not know that his happiness, small and secret and new as the snowdrops along the wall, was already being weighed and measured in a distant drawing-room by a hard, bright woman who understood, as Julian did not yet understand, that the surest way to destroy a thing is to wait until its owner cannot bear to lose it. He knew only that the fever had passed, and that a curate had told him a true thing on the way back from a grave, and that when he sat in the low cottage by the old man's chair and Nell moved quiet at the hearth behind them, he did not want to be anywhere else in the world, and did not, for whole hours together, remember that he was the 9th Duke of Wexholt at all. The winter broke slowly, as northern winters do, with false springs that froze again overnight and a wind that never quite forgot its teeth. The stag mended and was gone one gray morning, back to the deep coverts of the high wood, and Julian was surprised by how sharply he felt the loss of it, for while the beast lay healing at the mere he had possessed a reason of a kind to turn the gray down that way. Now he had none. He turned the gray down that way regardless. He did not always find her. When he did, they talked, and the talk was never what it should have been. A duke and a dairymaid ought to exchange perhaps 6 words in a lifetime, and those 6 words all on one side. Instead, he found that he told her things. He told her, one raw March morning while the plovers cried over the ploughland, about his wife, not the arranged and dutiful marriage the county remembered, but the truth of it, that Cecilia had been kind and frightened and far too young, that he had scarcely known her before the fever took her, that his grief these 11 years had been less the grief of a lover than the slow, appalled grief of a man who understood too late that he had never once made her laugh. He had told no one that. He had not known he knew it until he heard himself saying it to a girl scouring a milk pail with river sand. "That is a hard thing to carry," Nell said, not looking up from the pail. "But you are carrying the wrong end of it, if you'll forgive me. You grieve that you were cold to her. Well, you cannot warm her now. But you are alive yet, your grace, and there is a whole estate full of people you might be less cold to, and it seems to me a poor sort of penance that spends itself entirely on the one person it can no longer reach." He thought about that for a great many days. He began in small ways to be less cold. He would not have called it that. He would have called it attending to business he had let slide. He rode the estate and looked, for the first time in 11 years, at the faces. He found the Widow Peel's roof let in the rain and had it thatched. He found the school at Wexholt Magna had wanted a master for 2 years and its dozen children ran wild, and he wrote to Cambridge for a curate and paid the man's stipend himself. He found that his steward, Mr. Pruitt, had for a decade been quietly rack-renting the cottages at the edge of the estate and pocketing the difference, and he turned Mr. Pruitt off without a character, and half the county said the Duke had run mad, and the other half, the half that lived in the rack-rented cottages, said the Duke had run sane and blessed him for it, and did not know that the whole reformation had begun with a milk pail and a girl's plain speaking. Ottilie watched it all with the sharp attention of a woman who has staked her family's fortunes on her brother's good sense. She was not a cruel woman, Ottilie. She was a frightened one in her way, as frightened for the great cold house and the empty nursery, and the dukedom that would pass if Julian died childless to a cousin she detested. And so she did what frightened, capable women have always done. She made a plan. The plan had a name, and the name was Lady Sybil Aldous. Lady Aldous had been of the hunting party at the mere, the woman on the grey mare who had suggested the girl be whipped back to her scullery, and she was everything, Ottilie pointed out, that a Duchess of Wexholt ought to be. She was the daughter of an earl and the widow of a viscount, 35 and handsome in the hard, bright way of a diamond, mistress of her own considerable fortune, wanting only a coronet grand enough to be worth her trouble. She understood land and rentrolls and the management of great houses. She would give Julian an air with the brisk efficiency of a woman ordering a new carriage, and she would run Wexholt Abbey like a regiment, and she would never once in her life stand between him and anything he wanted, least of all a stag. "She is coming to stay for the Easter fortnight," Ottilie announced over breakfast in the tone of a woman reporting the weather. "With her aunt for propriety, I could hardly refuse. Her mother was our mother's dearest friend. You will be civil, Julian, more than civil. You are 40 years old, and there is not one drop of your blood downstairs in a cradle, and I will not stand quietly by and watch you moon over milk pails while the whole inheritance goes to cousin Bertram, who cheats at cards and beats his dogs." "I do not moon," said the Duke, "over milk pails." "No," said his sister, buttering her toast with the terrible serenity of a woman who has already won. "Of course you don't. Lady Sybil arrives Thursday." She arrived Thursday. She was, Julian was obliged to admit, a magnificent creature, sweeping into the great hall in a traveling costume of bronze silk with a fur tippet and a hat like a marshal's standard, her aunt trailing behind her like a tender to a first-rate ship of the line. She gave Julian her gloved hand and a smile with a great deal of white in it, and said how very charming it was to see the Abbey again, though she trusted the Duke had recovered from his little turn at the winter hunt. Here a bright glance, all edges, for she did so hope he had not taken a chill, standing about in the cold to spare the life of a deer. "I took no chill," Julian said. "The deer, I am glad to say, recovered fully." "How droll you are," said Lady Sybil, who plainly did not think him droll at all, and whose handsome face, for one unguarded instant, showed him the whole of her. A woman who had priced the dukedom to the last acre and did not intend to be outbid by a stag. The fortnight was an ordeal of the particular kind the well-born inflict upon one another. All long dinners and longer evenings, cards and music and pointed conversations in window embrasures, Ottilie steering the two of them together with the relentless gentle pressure of a river shaping a bank. Lady Sybil was clever, and where she chose to please she pleased very well. She talked knowledgeably of drainage and enclosure and the price of wool. She rode hard and straight across country. She was never at a loss. And Julian, who a year before might have drifted into the marriage as into a comfortable and useful arrangement, found the whole business unbearable, and could not at first understand why, until one evening in the second week Lady Sybil chanced to speak of the estate improvements. "I hear you have been the very model of a reforming landlord," she said, over the chessboard, moving a bishop with a click. "Roofs and schools and a curate and turning off your steward. Most conscientious, though one wonders where it ends. If a duke goes about mending every leaking roof and schooling every cottager's brat, he will beggar himself in a decade, and the cottagers will only breed the faster. There is a natural order to these things, Wexholt. The poor are poor because Providence has appointed them so, and a wise man does not quarrel with Providence. Charity in moderation, of course one must be seen to be good, but you have rather the air of a man who has begun to believe it matters. It does matter, Julian said, and heard with a small cold shock, whose voice was in his own a girl at a mere, saying most creatures mend if someone will take the trouble, most people too. It matters a very great deal. I was a long time understanding that. I do not intend to unlearn it now. Lady Sybil looked at him across the chessboard for a long moment, and something recalculated behind her handsome eyes, and she smiled and said how earnest he was, and took his knight, and the game went on. But she had marked it, that flicker. She was far too clever not to have marked it. She began from that evening to make quiet inquiries of the servants, in the pleasant, unhurried way of a woman gathering intelligence before a campaign. And the servants, who feared her, and who liked their own Nell Caro not at all the less for her being a favorite of the Duke's, told her a very little, and hinted at more. And by the end of the Easter fortnight Lady Sybil Aldous knew that the reforming Duke of Wexholt had a habit of riding down to the home farm dairy on mornings when he might have been anywhere in the 3 ridings, and that the dairymaid there was old Simon Caro's girl, and that she was young, and that she was accounted a beauty by those with eyes to see under the mud. Lady Sybil said nothing of this to anyone. She was not a woman to waste a shot. She merely filed the knowledge away, and went home to her own estate at the fortnight's end with every appearance of warm cordiality, and told her aunt in the carriage that she rather thought she should have Wexholt in the end, but that there was a weed wanted pulling first, and that she was in no hurry, for weeds pulled early only grew again, whereas a weed left to flower could be pulled up root, and all when the flowering had made it plain to everyone what it was. Julian, blessedly ignorant of any of this, felt only the vast relief of the fortnight's ending. He saw the carriages away down the avenue and went straight to the stable, and had the grey saddled and rode, without pretending even to himself that he rode anywhere but to the dairy. Nell was in the dairy yard, her sleeves pushed to the elbow, turning a great yellow cheese upon its board. She glanced up as his shadow fell across the cobbles, and he saw her take in his face, and saw her own soften a very little from its usual wariness. "They are gone, then," she said. "They are gone. The county says you are to marry Lady Aldous." "The county," said the Duke, "says a great many things." She turned the cheese. The morning light came slantwise into the yard and lay along the whitewashed wall and caught the fine down on her forearm and the loose strand of dark hair against her cheek, and Julian stood in the gateway with his hat in his hand. He had taken his hat off. He noticed, without deciding to, as a man does in a church, and understood with the completeness of a thing long resisted and suddenly surrendered to, that he was in love with her, not charmed, not intrigued, not seeking penance for a dead wife in the person of a living girl. In love, wholly and hopelessly, and against every dictate of his rank and his sense, with a dairymaid who scoured her own pails and sent back his hampers and told him true things to his face. "Nell," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. She went very still, the cheese half turned beneath her hands. "Your Grace should not," she said low. "Should not what?" "Should not say my name like that, in that voice. There is no good end to it, and we both of us know there is no good end to it, and it is unkind to pretend otherwise. You are the Duke of Wexholt. I am a milkmaid with a dying father and a shilling a week. In a story it comes out sweetly. In the world it comes out with me turned off without a character and the whole county laughing at you and at me and my father dying ashamed. So do not say my name like that, please." Her voice broke on the last word only slightly, but he heard it, and understood that she was not indifferent, that whatever grew in him had its answer in her, and that this was the worst thing of all, because it meant the pain was not his to bear alone. "I would not shame you," he said. "I would never." "You would not mean to," she said. "That is not the same thing. Go home, your Grace. Ride your grey home and be the good landlord you have learned to be, and let me be. I am glad," she stopped and made herself say it plainly in the way she said everything. "I am glad to have known you when you were unkind and to have seen you grow kind. I will keep that. But I cannot keep you, and you cannot keep me, and the sooner we are both reconciled to it, the less it will cost us in the end." She turned the cheese the last quarter turn, and set down her cloth, and went into the dark doorway of the dairy without looking back, and left the Duke of Wexholt standing bareheaded in the sunlit yard with his hat crushed in his 2 hands, learning, at 1 and 40, the thing his rank had spared him all his life. What it was to want something that all the acres and rents and titles in the north of England could not buy him, because the one thing needful was the free consent of a girl too proud to be bought, and too honest to pretend she did not love him. He rode home the long way, through the high wood, and once at the edge of a clearing he saw the stag healed, its coat gone glossy with the spring, its head crowned with the new velvet of its antlers, lift its head and look at him without fear across 100 yards of bluebells, and then turn, unhurried, and melt into the green shadow. And Julian sat his horse a long time in the empty clearing, and thought that he had spared the creature's life on a whim in the dead of winter, and that in the sparing something had come alive in himself that he did not think would ever go back to sleep, whatever it cost him, whatever the county said, whatever his sister planned. If the dairy yard had shown Julian the truth of his own heart, the weeks that followed taught him the labor of governing it. For a man may fall in love in an instant, standing bareheaded in a sunlit yard, but he must then live day upon ordinary day in a world that has no place for what he feels, and that living is the harder thing, and Julian was not practiced at it. He could not court her. He had understood that at the Mere and understood it better now. And so he set himself, through that green and treacherous spring, to a kind of courtship that had no name and broke no rule that any magistrate could point to, the courtship of usefulness, of presence, of the slow accumulation of small hours. He found reasons. The dairy roof, the orchard, a lame heifer, a question about the drains. Any pretext served that put him for half an hour within sound of her voice, and she saw through every one of them and told him so tartly, and did not send him away. "You have come about the heifer," she said one May evening, not looking up from the calf she was feeding at a bucket, her hand guiding its blunt, eager head. "Your Grace has ridden the whole length of the home park to inquire after a heifer that Tom Ackroyd could have told you was mending. There is a word for a man who invents such errands, and it is not a word a milkmaid should say to a duke, so I will not say it, but I will think it, and your Grace may guess it if he likes." "I like your company," Julian said, which was as near to the plain truth as he had yet come, and he watched the color rise in her throat and knew that the plainness had reached her. "That is a dangerous liking," she said low, "and you know it is, and I know it is, and the calf knows it. I shouldn't wonder. There is no future in it, your Grace. There is only a present that will cost us both dear when it ends." "Then let it not end." "It must end. It ends the day you remember who you are." "I have been trying," said Julian, "these 3 months to forget who I am, and I find I am making excellent progress, and I have you to thank for it, and I do not mean to stop." And she had laughed, despite herself, that reluctant broken laugh he had come to hunt for, and had told him he was a great fool, and had let him stay while she finished with the calves, and they had talked of nothing and of everything in the long gold light. And Julian had ridden home in the dusk more content than any pretext about a heifer had any right to make a man. But the spring had eyes. Ottilie, who missed very little, had begun to remark her brother's absences, and to remark the direction of them, and to draw the conclusions a clever frightened woman draws. She said nothing to Julian, not yet. She was too wise to force a thing before she understood its strength. She merely watched and made her quiet inquiries below stairs, and grew, week by week, more certain and more afraid. And it was in that spring, though Julian did not know it, that his sister first turned over in her mind the name of Lady Sybil Aldous, and first began to lay the slow, careful train that would, in the autumn, blow his happiness to pieces. Love and fear moved through Wexholt that May in the same green light, the one out at the home farm among the calves and the orchard blossom, the other within doors in the yellow drawing-room over an embroidery frame, and neither yet knew the strength of the other, and both were gathering. Julian felt none of it. He knew only the calves and the blossom and the girl's reluctant laugh, and the healed stag that he saw twice more that spring at the edge of the high wood, glossy and unafraid, lifting its crowned head to watch him pass. He had spared its life on a whim in the dead of winter, and it had gone free and thriven. And he let himself think, riding home through the blossom, that perhaps a thing spared against all sense might thrive after all, that perhaps the world was not so iron as his rank had taught him, that perhaps a duke might spare something for himself once and see it live. It was a spring's foolishness, and it did not survive the autumn. But it was sweet while it lasted, and he was right about it in the end, though he had to lose it first and nearly lose her before the sparing came true. Spring came on in earnest, and with it 100 small occasions that a wiser man would have declined, and that Julian, who had given up entirely on being wise where Nell Caro was concerned, sought out instead. He could not court her, he understood that much. To court a dairymaid openly was to ruin her, and she had told him plainly she would not be ruined, and he believed her and honored it. So he did the only thing left to a man in love who has been forbidden the ordinary language of love. He learned her world, and made himself useful in it, and hoped that usefulness might say what he was not permitted to say aloud. He found excuses. The home farm wanted a new dairy floor, and he came to see it laid and stayed to talk. The orchard beyond the walled garden had been let go to moss and canker for want of a man to prune it, since old Simon could no longer climb, and Julian, who had never in his life held a pruning knife, had the head gardener teach him, and spent a fortnight of spring evenings up an apple tree with his coat off and his shirt sleeves rolled, working the dead wood out of the old trees. Within sight of the cottage window where Simon Caro sat propped in the morning light, and watched a duke prune his orchard, and shook his grizzled head in wonder. For Julian went to the cottage. He went the first time on the pretext of the orchard and stayed an hour, and the second time on no pretext at all, and by May he went 2 or 3 evenings a week and sat by the old man's chair and talked of nothing and everything. And it was in that low thatched room, with its one good window facing east, that he came to understand where Nell Caro had got her fierceness and her plain speech and her refusal to be bought. Simon Caro was dying and knew it and was not much afraid. He had been 40 years in the gardens of the abbey, and he spoke of the great house and its dukes without either servility or bitterness, as a man speaks of the weather he has lived under. "You're not like your father, your grace, if you'll pardon me saying," the old man said one warm evening, his breath coming shallow, Nell moving quiet at the hearth behind them. "Your father was a hard man and a fair one, and he never once came to this cottage nor thought to, and I don't say it against him, for that was the way of things and he kept to it honest. But you come. I've puzzled over it. A duke coming 3 nights in the week to sit with a dying gardener." He turned his head, and his eyes, still sharp in the wasted face, went from Julian to his daughter at the hearth and back again, and Julian understood that the old man had puzzled it out entirely, and was telling him so, and was giving him, in his roundabout country way, the chance to speak or to be silent. Julian was silent, but he did not look away, and Simon Caro saw that too. "She's worth more than she'll ever let herself be reckoned," the old man said, very low so that the girl at the hearth should not hear. "Her mother was the same, proud as Lucifer and soft as new bread underneath, and she'd have died before she'd take a thing she hadn't earned. It cost her, that pride. It'll cost the girl too if she's not careful, and she's not careful, she's worse than her mother ever was." He paused for breath. "I'll not be here to see her through it, that's the one thing frets me. She'll have no one, not a soul in the world but a cheese press and a cold dairy and her own 2 hands. His hand, all knuckle and vein, closed suddenly on Julian's wrist with a strength that startled him. "You'll not toy with her, your grace. I'll say that once, and I'm past the age of being turned off for saying it. If you mean her kindly, mean it all the way, whatever it costs your name. And if you can't mean it all the way, if your name's worth more to you than her heart, then be kind now and let her be, and go and marry your fine lady, and leave my girl her pride to keep her warm when I'm gone. Those are the only 2 honest roads, your grace. There's no third that isn't cruelty dressed up as feeling." "I know it," Julian said. His own voice was not steady. I have known it since the winter." "And which road, then?" The Duke looked at the girl at the hearth. She had her back to them, stirring something in the pot, but her stillness told him she had heard at least the shape of it, that the low words had carried far enough. And he found that the answer was in him complete, and had been for weeks, and wanted only the asking to be spoken. "All the way," he said, "whatever it costs my name." Simon Carroll let go his wrist and sank back in the chair and closed his eyes, and something in the old face eased, some long-held vigilance laid down at last. "Then I'll die easier than I look to," he said. "Though you'll have the devil's own work of it, the both of you. She'll fight you, and the world'll fight you, and you'll wish 100 times you'd taken the easy road." He opened one eye. "But you won't wish it the 101st time, your grace, not if it's true." "I never once wished it with her mother, and I'd have starved for that woman and did near enough, and I'd do it again this minute if I had the breath." He smiled, a slow, toothless country smile. "Now go home. It's late, and you're keeping a dying man up past his hour, and my girl'll have my hide." Julian went home, but he carried the old man's words with him up the dark ride, and they lodged in him and would not be dislodged. "Whatever it costs your name. Whatever it costs your name." He was 41 years old, and he had spent every one of those years in the certainty that his name was the first and greatest fact of his existence, the thing all other things arranged themselves around. And now a dying gardener in a thatched cottage had set that name in the scale against the heart of a milkmaid, and Julian had said all the way, and meant it, and lay awake half the night in the great cold state bedchamber of Wexholt Abbey, wondering how in God's name a man went about spending a thing he had been taught from the cradle was beyond price. Simon Carroll died 3 weeks later, on a soft June morning, with the martins wheeling round the eaves, quietly in his sleep, in the low room with the window facing east, so that the last thing the light touched was his face. Nell was with him. She had sat up the whole of the last night, and Julian knew it because he had ridden down at dawn, drawn by a dread he could not name, and had found the cottage door standing open, and the girl sitting very straight and dry-eyed beside the still figure in the chair, her father's cold hand held in both of hers, and the June light falling gold across them both. She did not weep when Julian came in. She did not weep at all, that day or at the burying 3 days after, and it frightened him more than any weeping could have, that terrible dry composure, the shutters down and bolted. He stood beside her at the graveside in the little churchyard at Wexholt Magna Duke, standing beside a dairymaid at a gardener's grave, and let the county make of it what it would. And when the sexton's spade began its work, she turned and walked away alone, refusing his arm, refusing everything, back down the lane toward the empty cottage, straight-backed and dry-eyed. And Julian let her go because he understood that there are griefs a person must be permitted to bear alone or not bear at all. But he went to her that evening. He could not stay away, and he found her at last undone, not weeping still, but sitting in the dark cold cottage with the fire gone out and her father's chair empty beside her, staring at nothing, all the fierce life gone out of her, and the sight of it went into Julian like a blade. He did not speak. He knelt at the cold hearth and built the fire up with his own hands, a duke on his knees at a cottage hearth. His fine coat streaked with ashen lit it and got it drawing, and when it had caught and the warmth began to come into the dead room, he rose and pulled the other chair close and sat down. And still he said nothing, only sat with her in the firelight, near enough that she should not be alone, far enough that she should not feel pressed, and waited. It was a long while before she spoke. When she did, her voice was small and terribly steady. "There is no one now," she said. "I have been telling myself all day there is no one now, to see could I make it true, and it is true, and I cannot make it any less true by saying it or by not saying it. There is no one in the whole world who belongs to me or I to them. I did not know a person could feel so light, like a leaf, like a thing that might just blow away and no one to know it had gone." "That is not true," Julian said. "It is true. You are kind to say otherwise, but it is true, and you of all people cannot mend it, for you are the very reason I dare not let it be mended. If I were to let you, if I were to lean even a little on you," she turned her face to him at last, and the firelight was on it, and the grief was on it naked, and beneath the grief something else that she was too spent to hide any longer. You would be all I had. Do you understand? Not a comfort, not a kindness, everything. The whole of my world. And a milkmaid cannot make a duke the whole of her world, your grace, because the day will come, it always comes, when the duke remembers he is a duke, and then the milkmaid has nothing less than nothing, for she has given away even her pride, which was the one thing that was hers. Her voice cracked at last, and the tears came, finally, terribly, the whole day's damned grief breaking at once. I cannot afford you, she wept. That is the whole of it. I love you and I cannot afford you, and there is no one left in the world to tell me not to be a fool, and so I must tell myself, over and over, or I am lost. Julian left his chair and knelt before hers and took her two cold hands in his, and she let him, and that was the worst and the best of it, that in her grief she let him. Then let me say it, he said, low and steady and with a certainty that came up out of some depth in him he had not known he owned. Not tonight. I would not press a woman on the day she has buried her father. I am not so great a fool as that. But hear it once and keep it and take it out and look at it when you are stronger. I am not offering you comfort, Nell. I am not being kind. I have been kind this winter, learning it late, and I know now what kindness is, and this is not that. I am telling you that I love you, the whole of you, the pride and the plain speech and the ash-gray shawl and the milk pails and the terrible honesty that has never once spared me, and that I mean to marry you before God and the county and my sister and the king himself if it comes to that, and let them make of it what they will. You have said you cannot afford me. Very well. Then I will pay. I have spent 41 years learning what my name is worth, and I have lately learned it is worth exactly nothing set beside you, and I mean to spend it, all of it, and count the spending the best bargain I ever made. He raised her cold hands and pressed his lips to the reddened knuckles once gently. Not tonight. Only do not tell yourself there is no one, there is someone, there is me, and I am not going anywhere whatever you decide, whatever it costs. Grieve your father. I will keep the fire in, and when you are strong enough to fight me, I will be here to be fought. She wept then without restraint, the shutters down at last, and she did not pull her hands from his, and the fire he had built with his own two hands burned up warm and bright in the little cottage, and outside the June dark came down soft over the walled garden and the sleeping estate, and neither of them said anything more, for there was nothing more that needed saying that night, and a great deal that would need saying in the hard days to come. The weeks after Simon Caro's burying were the strangest of Julian's life, and until they curdled, the sweetest. He had told Nell he would keep the fire in and wait until she was strong enough to fight him, and he was as good as his word. He did not press her, did not repeat his declaration, did not so much as touch her hand. He simply came 2 or 3 evenings in the week and made himself useful, and let the summer do its slow work of healing. And the estate, watching, made up its own mind about the matter long before either of the principals would say a word. For a curious thing had begun to happen at Wexholt that spring, which the county and its grand houses knew nothing of, and would not have understood if it had. Among the cottagers and the farm servants, among the very people whose faces Julian had learned at last to see, the notion of the Duke and old Simon's girl had ceased to be a scandal and become, quietly, a hope. They had watched him nurse the fever and prune the orchard and sit with the dying gardener. They had watched Nell go gray with grief and the Duke's own household soften toward her. And where the gentry, when the rumor reached them, saw only a great man demeaning himself, the poor of Wexholt saw one of their own lifted up, and took a fierce protective interest in it, and closed ranks around it in the wordless way of country people guarding something precious and fragile from the frost. It showed in small ways. The dairymaids at the home farm, who might have been expected to resent Nell's fortune, instead shielded her from gossip and did her heavier tasks unasked when grief made her clumsy. The old gamekeeper Charlton, gruffest of men, took to leaving a brace of rabbits or a basket of trout on the cottage step, saying nothing, as though the game had walked there itself. Mr. Ellery the curate came often, and read to Nell in the long light evenings from the few precious books she owned, and asked her once with great delicacy whether there was any way he might serve her, and when she said there was not, only smiled and said that the offer stood, and that a parish was a family, and that she was not so alone as she believed herself. And Julian, watching all this from the edges, understood that Nell Caro, who had told him on the night of her father's death that there was no one left in the world who belonged to her, was in fact surrounded, held up on every side by a whole community that had decided, without any of its members quite saying so aloud, that she was one of its treasures and would be defended as such. It gave him a wild, unreasoning hope, for if the estate could see past her station, if the people who had known her as a dairymaid could love her and champion her, then perhaps, he let himself think, the thing was not so impossible as everyone insisted. Perhaps the doors his sister prophesied would close were not, after all, the only doors in the world. Perhaps a man might build a life on the good opinion of the people who tilled his land, rather than the people who dined at his table, and count himself the richer for the exchange. There came an evening in that false dawn of a summer that Julian remembered ever after as the happiest of the whole courtship, and the last before the frost. It was midsummer, the longest day, and the estate held its old midsummer bonfire on the green at Wexholt Magna, a custom older than the dukedom itself, and Julian went down to it, a thing no Duke of Wexholt had done in living memory, and stood among his tenants in the long gold evening while the fire was lit and the fiddler struck up and the young people danced on the trodden grass. And Nell was there. She was in half-mourning still, a plain gray gown, and she did not dance. But she stood at the edge of the firelight with the other women, and the children came to her, for children always came to Nell. She had that gift, and she had a small one on her hip and another clinging to her skirts, and she was laughing at something, her head thrown back, the firelight gold on her throat, and Julian stood across the green and watched her and forgot entirely to be a duke. Mr. Ellery was beside him. "There is your answer, your grace," the curate said quietly, following the direction of his gaze. "If you have been asking yourself whether it can be done, look at her among them. She is more a lady, standing there in her gray gown with a farm child on her hip, than any woman I have seen presented at a great table. Rank did not make her that. Rank cannot unmake it. The county will tell you a duchess must be born, but I have read a good deal of history, your grace, and I have observed that the great houses were all of them founded, somewhere back along the line, by a man bold enough to raise up the woman he loved and dare the world to say she was not fit. You would only be doing what your own founder did. The difference is that his boldness is 400 years old and respectable, and yours would be new and raw. Give it 400 years, and they will write your marriage in the family history and call it a great romance. It is only the living through the first of the 400 years that is hard." Julian did not answer. He was watching Nell settle the drowsy child against her shoulder and murmur something to its mother, and he was thinking that he would give the whole 400 years, and the dukedom besides, for the certainty that she would one day stand at his own hearth with his own child on her hip. And he was, for that one gold midsummer evening, almost happy enough to believe it might come true. It was that same evening, walking her home along the dusky lane afterward at a careful and proper distance, the bonfire glow still in the sky behind them, that she stopped at last by the cottage gate and turned to him and said the thing he had waited all summer to hear. She had come back to herself. The grief had done its slow work, and she stood in the blue dark with her chin up and told him in that steady way she had, that if she said yes to him she would be saying yes to a great deal of ugliness, and that she would not have him tell her afterward she had not been warned, and he said, "Consider me warned," and she said yes. But even in that moment, even in the first sweetness of it, the frost was closer than either of them knew. For Julian, walking home under the midsummer stars drunk on his own joy, did not see the figure that had watched the bonfire from the shadow of the churchyard yews, a maidservant in Lady Sybil Aldous' livery, sent north on a small errand of espionage, who had marked the Duke standing among the cottagers watching the Caro girl, and had marked the length of that watching, and who rode south the next morning to report to her mistress that the thing was further gone than they had feared. That the Duke had been seen at a peasant bonfire mooning over the dairymaid like a lovesick boy, and that if Lady Sybil meant to have Wexholt, she had best not delay past the summer. And Julian did not see, either, the other shadow that the good midsummer evening cast the shadow within his own house. For his sister Ottilie had also heard by now that her brother had gone down to a village bonfire, and Ottilie, who loved him, and who was frightened, and who had already fixed on Lady Sybil as the cure, sat in the yellow drawing-room that midsummer night and made up her mind that the time for hints was past, and that she would write to Sybil Aldous in the morning and beg her to come north for the Easter. No, it was too late for Easter. For the harvest, then, for the harvest supper, when the whole county would be gathered, and put an end, once and for all, to this madness before it destroyed everything the family had spent 400 years building. She meant it kindly. That was the pity of it. Every cruel thing that came was set in motion, that gold midsummer night, by two people who loved Julian and one who wished to own him, and not one of the three thought of herself as anything but reasonable. And between the three of them they very nearly broke him, and would have, had a girl not been strong enough to walk out of a barn alone, and a man not been humbled enough at last to ride 40 miles through the snow and say the one word he had failed to say when it mattered. But that was all to come. For the length of that midsummer, Julian Hart was happy, plainly and daily and without ceasing, and he did not know how few such days were left to him, and it is perhaps as well he did not, for they were very sweet, and he would not have traded one of them for all the wisdom in the world. She did not say yes at once. She was not a woman to be swept, and grief is a poor season for great decisions, and she made him wait through the whole of that raw green summer while she came back to herself. Julian bore the waiting better than he had thought he could, for the waiting was itself a kind of courtship, the only kind she would permit, and there was a sweetness in it he had never tasted in all the polished formalities of his rank. He did not press. He came to the cottage in the evenings and sat, and they talked, and slowly the fierce life came back into her, and slowly the space between the two chairs grew smaller, until there came an evening in late July when she looked at him across that small warm space and said, quite steadily, "If I say yes to you, I will be saying yes to a great deal of ugliness that will fall on you as much as on me, and I will not have you tell me afterward you were not warned." "Consider me warned," Julian said, and his heart was going like a boy's. "Then yes," said Nell Caro, "God help us both, yes." He did not sweep her into his arms, though he wished to. He took her hand instead and held it as though it were made of glass, and they sat a long while in the firelight not speaking, two people who had just agreed to set themselves against the whole weight of their world, and were, for that one evening, perfectly and foolishly happy. The happiness lasted precisely until he told his sister. Ottilie did not shout. That was the terrible thing about Ottilie. She never shouted. She set down her embroidery very carefully in the yellow drawing-room and looked at her brother for a long moment, and when she spoke her voice was so quiet and so reasonable that it frightened him more than any fury could have. "You cannot," she said. "I do not say you must not, Julian, though you must not. I say you cannot. It is not within your power. You are not a private gentleman who may please himself. You are the Duke of Wexholt, and the dukedom is a trust, and it does not belong to you to squander on a—" She paused, and chose the word with care, "on a sentiment. Marry the girl and you make her a laughing-stock and yourself a byword, and your children, if there are children, a line of half-bred nobodies whom no decent house will receive. You will not be defying society, Julian. You imagine you will stand nobly against the world for love. You will not. Society does not fight back. It simply closes the door quietly, one door after another, and one morning you will wake and find every door in England shut, and your wife weeping in a great cold house because she is asked nowhere and received by no one, and she will come at last to hate you for it, because you will have given her a coronet and taken away every friend she ever had and every scrap of the self-respect that was hers when she was honestly poor. That is not love, Julian. That is a slow murder dressed in orange blossom." She took up her embroidery again. "I will say no more. You are a grown man and I cannot stop you. But do not tell me I did not warn you, and do not, I beg you, expect me to stand at your side and smile while you do it. I love you far too well to watch you ruin two lives and call it romance." It was the cruelest thing she could have said, precisely because so much of it was true, and Julian carried it out of the yellow drawing-room like a wound. For Ottilie had named the very fear that Nell herself had named the slow closing of doors, the great cold house, the wife who comes to hate the husband who cost her everything, and hearing it in his sister's reasonable voice gave it a weight it had not had before. The county obliged Ottilie's prophecy almost at once. Word got out, word always gets out, and where in the winter Julian had been merely eccentric, now he was scandalous. Invitations thinned. Old friends grew cool. Sir Roderick Vane cut him dead at the quarter sessions, and a dowager who had dandled Julian on her knee sent back his card. It was exactly as Ottilie had said. Not a battle, but a quiet shutting of doors, so mild in each instance and so total in some that a man could hardly point to the injury, and yet felt it in every bone. And into this cooling climate, at exactly the right moment, with the exquisite timing of a woman who has waited all summer for the ground to be prepared, came Lady Sybil Aldous. She came ostensibly to condole. She had heard, she said, that dear Wexholt was become the object of the most unkind gossip, and she had come at once, as an old friend of the family, to lend him the support of her countenance in his difficulty. She came in a great deal of expensive black, having recently lost a distant cousin, which lent her an air of grave sympathy that was worth, she calculated, a good deal more than smiles. And she came with a plan so simple and so vicious that Julian, who had learned a great deal that year but had not yet learned to think as a cornered predator thinks, never saw it coming. Lady Sybil did not attack Nell. That was the elegance of it. She praised her. To Ottilie, to the neighbors, to Julian himself, she spoke of the dairymaid with the warmest condescension. Such a striking young woman, so much natural dignity, one quite saw the attraction. It did the Duke credit that he should feel it, for a coarse man would have simply taken his pleasure and thought no more of it, whereas dear Wexholt, being fine-natured, must dress his fancy up as love. She said this last with the tenderest smile in company, and the company laughed, and the words did their work. They made Julian's love a thing faintly ridiculous, a rich man's whim ennobled in his own imagination, and they made Nell, by implication, a girl who had angled cleverly for a coronet and half caught it. And then, having established herself as the reasonable friend, Lady Sybil went hunting. She had learned over her summer of quiet inquiry everything there was to learn about the household of Wexholt Abbey, including the one fact that could be turned to a weapon, that there was, among the upper servants, a woman named Mrs. Kell, the still-room keeper, who had wanted the dairy for her own niece and had hated Nell Caro with a slow domestic hatred for 3 years, ever since the Duke's late steward had given the dairy to old Simon's girl instead. Lady Sybil found Mrs. Kell. She was very kind to Mrs. Kell, and Mrs. Kell, who wanted only a little encouragement and a promise of the niece's advancement when Lady Sybil should be mistress of the Abbey, was persuaded to remember certain things, and to remember them at a certain time, and to remember them loudly. The certain time was the harvest supper. It was the custom at Wexholt, as at every great estate, that when the last of the wheat was carried, the Duke should give a supper for the whole estate in the great tithe barn, masters and men, gentry and cottagers, all under one roof for one night of the year. Julian had let the custom lapse in his years of grief, and had revived it that summer, at Nell's urging, as part of his slow turning outward toward the people whose faces he had learned at last to see. It was to be a great occasion, the whole estate gathered and half the county come to gawp, for everyone knew that the Duke meant at that supper to present the dairymaid publicly, not yet as his betrothed, even he was not so reckless, but as a person of consequence, honored at the high table, a first careful step toward the impossible thing he meant to do. He meant it as a beginning. Lady Sybil meant to make it an ending. The barn was hung with corn dollies and lit with 100 lanterns, and the trestles ran the whole length of it, and the whole estate crowded in, cottagers and dairymaids and ploughmen along the lower tables, the neighboring gentry and Lady Sybil sat at the high, and Nell Caro seated pale, straight-backed, brave, in a new grey silk that Julian had begged her to accept, and she had accepted at last only because to refuse would have been to make more of a small thing than she wished, seated at the Duke's right hand, in the place of honor, before the eyes of the entire county. Julian rose to speak. He had prepared a few careful words about the harvest, about the estate, about the debt a landlord owes the hands that keep his acres, words meant to honor Nell obliquely, to accustom the county to the sight of her in a place of consequence, a first small stone laid in a long patient wall. He got as far as thanking the men who had brought in the wheat. And then Lady Sybil Aldous, from her place at the high table, rose to her feet with a rustle of black silk and a bright terrible smile, and said in her carrying voice that she begged the Duke's pardon, but that before he honored Miss Carrow further, in justice to his Grace's own good name, there was something the whole company ought perhaps to hear, for it would be a wicked thing to let so fine a man be deceived, and she had the truth of it from an honest servant of the house who could no longer keep silent. And she turned and beckoned, and Mrs. Kell came forward into the lantern light with her hands folded, and her eyes cast down, and her whole meek posture a lie. And the great barn went silent, and the harvest supper that Julian had meant as a beginning tipped, in one breath, toward the ending Lady Sybil had prepared all summer to make of it. "Speak, Mrs. Kell," said Lady Sybil gently, as one encourages a reluctant witness. "No one will blame you. It is hard to speak against a fellow servant, I know, but truth is truth, and his Grace deserves the truth." Mrs. Kell raised her meek eyes. "It grieves me to say it, your Grace," she said, and her voice trembled with a rehearsed emotion that carried to the very rafters, "for I've served this house 20 years and I want no trouble. But I've watched that girl work her way up out of the dairy this 12-month, and I've held my tongue, and I can't hold it no longer, not seeing her set at your right hand like a lady. She's not what she seems, your Grace. There's money gone from the still-room this half-year, bit by bit silver spoons and a length of good lace, and a little gold snuff-box that was your late grandmother's, and I've said nothing, for I couldn't prove it, but I've seen her at the presses when she'd no call to be there, and I ask you plain, your Grace, before all these people, where does a dairymaid on a shilling a week come by a new gray silk gown?" She let the question hang, and then delivered the blow she had been paid to deliver. "I say it's a thieving girl that's turned your head, your Grace, and better you should know it now at the start than after she's mistress of your keys." The barn erupted, a great confused roar of 100 voices, the gentry at the high table exchanging glances of delicious horror, the cottagers below murmuring in shock and indignation, some for Nell and some against, for a crowd is a crowd and there is nothing it loves so well as a fall. And through it all Julian saw only Nell's face. He saw the blood go out of it. He saw her look, not at Mrs. Kell, not at Lady Sybil, but down at the gray silk of her own gown, the gown he had begged her to accept. And he saw her understand, in one appalling instant, exactly how the trap had been baited and sprung, that the very kindness she had allowed him had been turned into the proof of her guilt. And then he saw her look at him. And in that look was the thing he had dreaded above all others, the thing she had warned him of at the mere and at the cottage and had made him swear to guard against. She was waiting to see whether he would defend her. She had given him her yes, her pride, the whole of her fierce, guarded heart, and now, before the entire county, she was waiting to learn whether the Duke had remembered he was a duke. Julian stood, and here his year of learning both served and failed him. A wiser man, a man bred to the cornered fury of his class, would have crushed the thing on the instant with the sheer weight of his rank, would have declared Mrs. Kell a liar and Lady Sybil a schemer, and dared any soul in that barn to say otherwise. That was what Nell needed. That was what the moment demanded, not justice, not evidence, but the instant, unhesitating public shield of the man who loved her. But Julian was a fair man, and a deliberate one, and 11 years of governing himself against feeling had taught him to distrust his own first impulses, and so he did the fatal, decent, ruinous thing. He hesitated. He said, in the level voice he used for judgment, that these were grave charges and should be looked into properly, that Mrs. Kell should be heard and Miss Carrow should be heard, that he would have the matter investigated at once and fairly, and would not have any person condemned on the word of another without proof. And he was right, entirely right, and it was the worst thing he could possibly have done, for Nell did not hear a fair man promising an inquiry. She heard the man she loved decline in her hour of need to say the one thing that mattered, which was, "I know she is innocent because I know her." She heard investigate. She heard looked into. She heard the great cold machinery of the Duke's fairness grinding into motion, and she understood, with the terrible clarity of a proud heart confirmed in its deepest fear, that when the test came, the Duke had chosen his justice over her, his good name over her, the appearance of even-handedness before the county over the one woman who had never in her life been anything but honest with him. She rose from the high table. She was very white and very steady, and the barn fell silent to watch her. "There is no need to investigate, Your Grace," she said, and her voice, though quiet, carried into every corner of that great hushed space. "I have never taken so much as a pin that was not mine, but I see that my word is to be weighed against Mrs. Kell's, and inquiries made and evidence sifted, and my honesty put upon its trial before all these people, and that is answer enough. A woman who is believed does not need to be investigated. You have told me this half-year that you loved me. I find that your love reaches exactly as far as your good opinion and no further, and stops dead at the first moment it might cost you something to give it freely. Keep the gown. I never wanted it. I told you I could not afford you, Your Grace, and you would not believe me. Believe me now." She unpinned with steady fingers a little brooch he had given her, the one gift she had accepted, a small thing, a spray of enameled forget-me-nots, and she laid it on the white cloth before him, and she turned and she walked the whole length of the great silent barn, past the high table and the shocked gentry and the murmuring cottagers, out into the harvest dark, straight-backed and dry-eyed, exactly as she had walked from her father's grave, alone, refusing every arm. Julian stood frozen for the space of 3 heartbeats that he would curse for the rest of his life, before the paralysis broke and he went after her, thrusting back his chair, calling her name into the sudden uproar of the barn. But by the time he reached the great doors, the harvest dark had swallowed her, and though he called and though he searched the yards and the lanes with a lantern half the night, she was gone, and the cottage, when he came to it, stood dark and empty, the fire cold on the hearth, her few poor things bundled and taken, and only her father's empty chair left behind in the moonlight to tell him what he had lost. The truth came out within the week, as truth generally does, and far too late to matter. Julian, half mad with self-reproach, set an inquiry going in bitter earnest, the very inquiry he should never have promised, and it took his new steward less than 3 days to unravel the whole shabby plot. The missing silver was found, not spirited away by Nell, but locked in Mrs. Kell's own box beneath her own bed, hidden there by Mrs. Kell to be produced as evidence and then quietly restored. The still-room keeper, confronted and terrified now that her patroness was nowhere to be found, confessed the whole of it. The hatred, the promise of her niece's advancement, the money Lady Sybil had pressed into her hand, the words she had been coached to say, and the night she had been told to say them. And Lady Sybil Aldous, when Julian rode to her house white with fury to fling the whole filthy business in her handsome face, met him with a serenity that never once cracked. "You cannot prove I gave that woman a farthing," she said over her tea, entirely composed. "She will say I did, of course, to save her own neck, but she is a self-confessed thief and a liar, and who will take her word against mine? No, Wexholt, you can prove nothing, and you know it, and even if you could, what then? I have done you a service, though you are too besotted to see it. I have shown you and shown the county exactly what your dairymaid was made of. Did she stand her ground and demand her rights like a lady? She did not. She flung down your brooch and ran off into the night like the servant she is, the moment things grew difficult. A duchess does not run, Wexholt. I would not have run. Your milkmaid ran because she has the soul of a milkmaid, and no coronet on earth could have changed it, and one day when you have got over this fever you will thank me." She set down her cup. "I am still willing to marry you, you know. The offer stands. The county will forget all this in a season, and you will still want an heir, and I am still the most suitable woman in 3 counties. When you are ready to be sensible, you know where I am." And there it was, the pride of Lady Sybil Aldous, absolute and unbreakable, so certain of its own right ordering of the world that it could scheme a good woman into ruin and call it a service. Julian looked at her across the tea-table and understood at last and completely the difference between the two women who had contended, all unknowing, for his life. Nell Caro had run from that barn not because she had the soul of a milkmaid, but because she had a heart too proud and too honest to plead for a belief that should have been freely given. Lady Sybil would not have run because Lady Sybil had never in her life risked anything she could not afford to lose. And Julian, who had spent 41 years being told that women like Lady Sybil were the natural mistresses of great houses and women like Nell were the hands that scoured the pails, saw the whole grand edifice of that belief for what it was, and turned his back on Lady Sybil Aldous without another word, and rode home through the September rain a man stripped of every certainty he had been born to, save one. The one that remained was this, that he had failed the only person who had ever loved him for himself in the one moment that love was tested, and that he did not deserve to find her, and that he was going to find her anyway and spend the whole rest of his life, if she would grant him so much as an hour of it, proving that a duke could learn, however late, to say I know she is innocent without first pausing to be fair. He did not know where she had gone. He had no clue, no direction, nothing but a cold cottage and an empty chair, and the enameled forget-me-nots he now carried always in his breast pocket over his heart, like a wound he refused to let close. But he had land and money and men, and a will that 11 years of grief had tempered to iron, and he bent every ounce of all of it from that September morning to the single purpose of finding Nell Caro and making right what his fairness had broken. The first weeks that followed were the darkest Julian had known since the fever year that took his wife, and darker in one respect, for that grief had been clean, a thing done to him by God and chance, whereas this was a wound of his own making, and there is no ache like the ache of a sorrow a man knows he authored himself. He did not sleep. He rode out at dawn and came back after dark and rode out again, quartering his own estate and the roads beyond it, stopping at every farm and inn and toll gate to ask after a young woman traveling alone. He grew gaunt and gray and terrible to look at, and the servants went softly around him, and even Ottilie, who had never in her life been at a loss for words, found she had none that would serve. The great house that had begun, that spring and summer, to fill with a new warmth, the warmth Nell had brought into it without ever crossing its threshold, went cold again, colder than before, for it is worse to lose the light after it has come than never to have known it. And the estate mourned with him, which he had not expected. For the poor of Wexholt had taken Nell Caro to their hearts, and when the tale of the harvest supper spread among them, the lie, the Duke's fatal hesitation, the girl's lonely walk into the dark, they did not, as the county did, cluck over the folly of a great man's fancy. They grieved honestly for one of their own driven out by the spite of her betters, and they closed ranks in their grief as they had closed ranks in their hope, and they let their Duke feel, in 100 small silent ways, that they held him to blame. No one said a word to him. Charlton, the gamekeeper, stopped leaving his gruff greetings. The dairymaids at the home farm fell silent when he rode into the yard. Widow Peel, whose life Nell had saved, met him on the lane one gray morning and looked at him with her old sharp eyes and said only, "You had the finest thing in 3 counties in your hand, your grace, and you weighed it. A body doesn't weigh a treasure. A body just holds on." And she had gone on down the lane with her bundle of sticks, leaving him sitting his horse in the drizzle, more thoroughly rebuked by an old woman's plain words than he had ever been in his life by any equal. Mr. Ellery alone did not reproach him, and it was to Mr. Ellery that Julian went, at last, in the worst of it, one black November midnight, hammering on the door of the little curacy like a man pursued, because he could no longer bear the inside of his own skull. The curate let him in and stirred the fire and gave him brandy he did not drink, and listened, through the small hours, while the Duke of Wexholt broke apart at last and confessed the whole of it, not the facts, which all the county knew, but the truth beneath the facts. That he had known she was innocent, known it in his bones, and had chosen the appearance of justice over her because some cold, proud part of him, the part 400 years of dukes had built, had not been able, even loving her, even in that final moment, to set a dairymaid's word above the forms and dignities of his rank. I did not disbelieve her, he said, his head in his hands. "That is the thing I cannot live with. If I had doubted her, I could forgive myself. A man may be deceived." But I did not doubt her for an instant. I simply could not bring myself before all those people to say so plainly, because to say it plainly was to declare myself hers before the whole county, and some part of me was not ready, and I paused. I paused to protect my own dignity, and the pause cost me her, and it was worth more than my dignity, worth more than my name, worth more than the whole dukedom, and I knew that too, and I paused anyway. What manner of man does that, Ellery? What manner of man knows the price of a thing exactly, and pays it away for nothing? "Proud one," said the curate gently. "Which is to say, a man. It is the oldest fault there is, your grace, and the one it takes the hardest schooling to unlearn, for pride wears the mask of every virtue. It called itself fairness in your barn, and you did not know it for what it was until it had done its work. But I will tell you a thing about that fault, having spent my life among the books that treat of it. It is not unforgivable. It is only unforgivable if a man will not see it. You see it. You have named it truly, at the cost of more pain than I have watched most men bear. That naming is the whole beginning of its cure. The question is not whether you can be forgiven, your grace. The question is whether you will find her, and having found her, whether you will have learned enough to say the thing plainly the second time, whatever it costs you. For you may be very sure the second time will cost you as dear as the first, and there will be no crowd to make it grand, only a tired, frightened woman who has stopped believing, and it will be harder, not easier, to stand up in front of her and give away your whole proud self than it was in the barn. If you can do that, if when you find her you can pay the price you flinched from paying, then this dark autumn will not have been waste. It will have been the schooling. But you must find her first." "I cannot find her. She has vanished off the face of the earth. She has no money, no name, no reason to leave a trail, and every reason to hide, and the north is wide, and winter is coming," and his voice cracked entirely. "And I am afraid, Ellery. I lie awake and I am afraid. Not that she is gone from me. I have earned that and could bear it if I knew her safe. I am afraid she has come to harm. A woman alone in this weather without means. I have set my men to the roads, and every day they bring me nothing, and every day the nothing might mean she has found a place and is well, or might mean she is lying in a ditch or a river and no one to know her name. That is the thought that will not let me sleep, that I drove her out into the dark and the dark took her, and I shall never even know." The false lead came a week later, and it very nearly killed him. Word reached one of his searchers from a hamlet 40 miles west, a young woman's body taken from a mill race, unknown, unclaimed, a stranger to the parish, buried by the overseers in a pauper's grave for want of anyone to say who she was. She answered, the report said, to the general description. Julian rode the 40 miles through a freezing night without stopping, and stood in a cold vestry at dawn while a nervous sexton described what had been found. And he thought, standing there, that his heart had stopped in his breast. And it was not until the sexton, prompted, mentioned that the drowned woman had been fair-haired and freckled and no more than 17 by the look of her, that Julian understood it was not Nell, could not be Nell, and the relief went through him so violently that he had to put out a hand to the vestry wall to keep his feet. It was not Nell. But it was some other man's, Nell, some father's daughter, some village's treasure, driven or fallen into the dark and drowned unknown, and Julian, who a year before would have ridden past such a grave without a glance, paid for the poor unknown girl a proper burying and a stone, and stood bareheaded in the sleet while it was done, and rode home weeping, for the girl he did not know and for the fear of the girl he did, and for the whole vast unregarded suffering of the poor that a dairymaid at a milk pail had first taught him to see, and that he would never again be able to unsee. He did not give up. The false lead which had shown him how the world might end hardened rather than broke him. He redoubled the search. He spent money like water. He wrote his 100 letters and set his men across 3 ridings and advertised his coded plea in every county paper. The fire is kept in. Come home. There is someone, and he waited and prayed, a man who had not prayed in earnest since boyhood, kneeling alone in the cold chapel of Wexholt Abbey among the tombs of the dukes who had never once, any of them, been humbled by love, and asking of God only this: not that she should forgive him, not that she should have him, but only that she should be found and found alive and found well, so that he might at the least ride to wherever she was and stand before her and pay, this time, the whole price he had flinched from paying, and give her the plain word he owed her, and then, if she sent him away, go and trouble her no more. Finding a woman who does not wish to be found, who has no money and no name that opens doors and no reason on earth to leave a trail, is not the work of a week. It was the work of the whole long autumn and into the black of winter, and it very nearly broke the Duke of Wexholt, who discovered in those months a capacity for patience and for anguish he had not known he possessed. He began where any man begins, with the roads. He learned that a young woman answering Nell's description had taken the northbound carrier's cart from Wexholt Magna the morning after the harvest supper, and paid her fare in small coin, and got down at the market town of Aldersgate 20 miles off, and there the trail went cold, for a market town swallows a solitary woman as the sea swallows a stone. He rode to Aldersgate himself and made inquiries at every inn and coaching house and registry office, a duke in a plain coat asking after a dairymaid, and got nothing but blank looks, and once a knowing leer that he answered with a look that wiped the man's face clean of it. He did not give up. He hired men, discreet, careful men, and set them combing the north for a young woman named Caro, or by any name, who had come new to service or to a mill town or a farmstead in that autumn, alone, with a way with animals and a tongue that spoke the truth too plainly for her own good. He wrote to every clergyman in 3 ridings. He advertised cautiously in the county papers a notice that only she would understand: the fire is kept in. Come home. There is someone. She did not answer. And meanwhile, at home, a change came over Wexholt Abbey, and its author was the last person Julian would have looked to. Ottilie had been present at the harvest supper. She had seen the whole of it: the accusation, her brother's fatal hesitation, the girl's white face and steady walk into the dark. And Ottilie, who had opposed the match with every reasonable weapon in her considerable armory, who had prophesied ruin and slow murder and closing doors, found, to her own great discomfort, that she could not get the sight of that steady walk out of her mind. She had expected, if the impossible match ever came to its inevitable grief, to feel vindicated. She did not feel vindicated. She felt ashamed. For she had watched a good woman destroyed by exactly the machinery of rank and reputation that Ottilie herself had invoked against her, and she had watched Lady Sybil Aldous, whom Ottilie had chosen, whom Ottilie had brought into the house to do the destroying, and she understood, slowly and with mounting horror, that she had been on the wrong side, and that her wisdom had been cowardice wearing wisdom's clothes. She made her confession to her brother on a gray November evening when he had come back from another fruitless week of searching, gray-faced and hollow-eyed. "I was wrong, Julian," she said, without preamble, for Ottilie did nothing by halves. "I told you it was not love, it was a slow murder dressed in orange blossom. I was wrong. What I brought into this house was the murder. Sybil Aldous. I chose her. I sang her praises and steered you toward her, and never once looked past the rentrole and the coronet to see what she was, because she was the kind of woman I had been taught to admire, and that girl was the kind I had been taught to overlook, and I overlooked her, and I helped destroy her, as surely as if I had coached that dreadful woman in the still room myself." Her voice, for once in her controlled life, shook. "Find her, Julian. And when you find her, if she will have you after what we did to her, you and I marry her, and let the county close every door in England, and I will stand at your side and dare them to close a door on my brother's wife. I mean it. I have never meant anything more. I have a great deal to make right, and I intend to make it right if it takes the rest of my days." And she was as good as her word, which was Ottilie's one unshakable virtue. Whatever she gave to the hilt. She threw the whole weight of her formidable will and her impeccable connections into the search alongside her brother's, and where his money and his men worked the roads and the mill towns, her letters worked the drawing rooms, and it was, in the end, through one of Ottilie's letters that the thread was found, not to Nell herself, but to a way of reaching her. For a young woman with a way with animals and too much honesty had indeed found a place, that autumn, and not 100 miles off. At a small stud farm on the high moors of the next county, kept by a widowed gentlewoman named Mrs. Harbottle, who bred hunters and had lost her groom to the influenza, and had taken on, out of a mixture of charity and shrewdness, a solitary young woman who turned up on foot one September evening and asked for work of any kind and proved, within a week, to be worth 3 grooms. For the wildest and most broken-mouthed horse on the place would gentle to her hand as no man's hand had gentled it. Mrs. Harbottle asked no questions. She had noticed the girl flinch at the name of Wexholt when it came up in some scrap of county gossip, and had drawn her own conclusions, and being a woman who had known her own share of grief, kept her conclusions to herself, and let the girl work and heal in peace. It was another gentlewoman, a friend of Mrs. Harbottle's and a distant correspondent of Ottilie's, who mentioned in an idle winter letter the strange, competent, solitary girl her friend had taken on up at the Moor Stud, who could do anything with a horse, and would tell you a home truth soon as look at you, and had come from nowhere, and given no history, and Ottilie, reading it over her morning chocolate, went so still that the chocolate cooled untasted in her cup. And then she rose and crossed the whole cold length of the Abbey to her brother's study without ringing for anyone, and put the letter in his hand and said, "Julian, I think I have found her." He was in the saddle within the hour. He rode through a December afternoon that thickened toward snow, 40 miles across the high bleak moors, changing horses twice and sparing neither himself nor the beasts, and came at last as the early dark was falling to a small gray stone farmstead huddled in a fold of the white hills, its windows lit gold against the coming storm, and reined in his blown horse in the yard, and swung down, and stood there suddenly unable to move, his heart hammering because through the half-open door of the long stable he could see, in the light of a lantern, a slight figure in a rough coat moving down the line of stalls with a feed bucket, murmuring to the horses in a low, steady voice he would have known in the dark at the bottom of the sea. She heard the hoofbeats. She turned in the stable doorway with the lantern in her hand, and the light fell on her face, and she saw who it was, and Julian watched every feeling he had learned to read in her cross that face in the space of a breath shock, and a leap of something bright and helpless that she could not suppress in time, and then, damping it down, hardening over it, the old wariness, the shudders, the pride. "You had no right to find me," she said, but her voice was not steady and they both heard it. "I had no right to anything," Julian said. "I have known that since the night I let you walk out of that barn. I have not come to claim a right. I have come to beg a hearing, and if you send me away after it I will go and not trouble you again. But I have ridden 40 miles through the snow, and I am asking you for the length of time it takes a kettle to boil. Will you give me that? Only that?" She stood a long moment in the lantern light, the snow beginning to sift down between them out of the darkening sky, and Julian did not breathe. Then she stepped back from the doorway, not toward him but not away, and said, "Lo, there is a fire in the tack room. Mrs. Harbottle is gone to the village and will not be back before the storm. You had best put your horse up before it founders. There is a stall at the end." And she turned and went in, and Julian understood that he had been granted his kettle's worth of time, and no more, and that everything he had ridden 40 miles to say must be said in it and said right, and that he had exactly one chance and would not be given another. He stabled his horse with hands that shook, and went into the small warm tack room where a fire burned in an iron grate and harness hung gleaming on the walls, and she stood by the fire with her arms folded and her chin up, braced against him, and he took off his hat and turned it in his hands that same helpless gesture, hat in hand before her, as in the sunlit dairy yard a lifetime ago, and he did not sit, and neither did she. And outside the snow came down, and shut the two of them into the small fire-lit room alone, with everything that had gone wrong between them. "Say it then," Nell said. "Your kettle is on the boil, I am listening." "I was wrong," Julian said. He had rehearsed 100 speeches over 100 miles of riding, and he abandoned every one of them now and spoke plainly, because plainness was the only coin she had ever accepted from him. "That is the whole of it, and everything else is only the working out. In the barn, when that woman stood up and lied, you turned and looked at me, and I knew I knew in my bones that you were innocent, that Mrs. Kell was lying, that something foul was afoot. I knew it as surely as I have ever known anything. And instead of saying so, instead of standing up and telling that whole county I know this woman and she is innocent and I will thrash the next person who says otherwise, instead of that, I paused to be fair. I called for an inquiry. I weighed your honesty against a liar's in the open before all those people, as though it were a thing that could be in doubt. And in that pause I lost you, and I deserved to, for you had asked me one thing only. From the very beginning you had told me at the Mere, and at the cottage, that a duke would one day remember he was a duke and the milkmaid would be left with nothing. And when the moment came, I proved you right. I chose my fairness over you. I chose the appearance of justice over the person I loved. And I have understood every hour of every day since that fairness that hesitates to defend the innocent is not fairness at all. It is only cowardice that has learned to quote the law. Nell said nothing, but her arms had loosened a little from across her breast, and her eyes on his face were very bright. They found the silver, Julian went on, in Mrs. Kell's own box. She confessed the whole of it, that Lady Sybil paid her, coached her, chose the night. It is all proven, all written down, and I have brought the papers if you wish to see them, though I did not come to clear your name with documents, for you never needed them cleared with me, and I am ashamed I ever let it seem you did. I came to tell you that I know you are innocent, and that I have always known it, and that the knowing was never the difficulty. The difficulty was that I, God forgive me, thought there was some duty higher than saying so. There is not. I have looked this whole autumn in every cold corner of that great house in my own cold heart, and there is nothing higher. There is only whether a man will stand up, in the moment it costs him, and say I know her and she is true and I am hers. I did not say it in the barn. I am saying it now. It is 3 months too late and 40 miles too far, and I have no right to your hearing at all, but I have said it. That is my kettle's worth. The rest is yours. The fire snapped in the grate. Outside, the snow hissed against the little window. Nell Caro stood by the fire and looked at the man who had crossed a snowbound moor to say to her, in a tack room that smelled of leather and horses, the thing he should have said in a lantern-lit barn before the whole county, and something in her face that had been held rigid for 3 months began, very slowly, to give way. "Do you know what the worst of it was?" she said at last, and her voice was low and unsteady. "It was not the lie, it was not even the county, it was that I had let myself believe you. I had told you and told you that I could not afford you, and you had worn me down, you and my father between you, until I set down my one defense and let myself love you and say yes to you. And then, the first hour it was tested, you paused. You weighed me. And I thought, there, you see, you knew this, you always knew this, and you let yourself forget it, and now look. I have never in my life been so ashamed as I was walking out of that barn, not of the lie, of my own foolishness for having hoped." "I know," Julian said. "I know it, and I cannot undo the shame of that walk. I can only tell you that I have walked it too, every night since, in my mind out of the barn, into the dark, and that I would give the whole dukedom to have those 3 heartbeats back and spend them differently." "You cannot have them back." "No. And you cannot promise me you will never pause again. No one can promise that. You are what you were made, Julian, a fair man, a careful man, a man who weighs." "I can promise you," Julian said, "that I have learned there is one thing that is not to be weighed, and that you are it, and that I would sooner be unfair to the whole rest of the world for the rest of my life than pause one instant again over you. I do not offer you a man who will never err. I offer you a man who has learned, at the cost of the worst grief of his life, exactly where he must never pause. That is all any of us can offer. It is a great deal less than you deserve. It is everything I have." She turned away from him then to the fire and stood with her back to him, and her shoulders shook once, and Julian did not move, did not dare to move, and the snow came down outside and the fire burned and the horses shifted in the stalls next door, and after a long while she said, without turning, in a voice thick with tears, "There is a good deal I gave up walking out of that barn. My pride mostly. I told myself it was pride kept me walking, but it was not. It was fear, the same as always. It is a great labor, being loved by a duke. I am not sure I am equal to it. The doors will close, exactly as your sister said. I will be laughed at in drawing rooms and cut in the street and blamed for your ruin by everyone who ever wished you well." "My sister," Julian said, "has changed her tune entirely and swears she will stand at your side and dare the county to cut you, and I would not be in the county's shoes when Ottilie is roused. And as for the doors, let them close. I spent 11 years behind a closed door of my own making, grieving a woman I never once made laugh, and no one in all that time thought to call it ruin. I know now what ruin is. Ruin is a great warm house with the one needful person not in it. I have lived in that ruin this whole autumn, and I will not live in it again. Close every door in England. I will build us a house with you inside it, and count myself the least ruined man alive." Nell turned. Her face was wet and her chin was up, and she was, Julian thought, looking at her across the small fire-lit room, more beautiful in her rough groom's coat with the tears on her cheeks than any woman had ever been in any ballroom in the world. "You are a great fool, Julian Hart," she said, "Duke of Wexholt." "I am," he agreed. "I have had the finest teacher in 3 counties, and I have applied myself." And she laughed, a broken, watery, astonished laugh, the first he had heard from her in months. And it was the sound he had once grieved that he had never drawn from his dead wife, and here it was, drawn from a living woman across a tack-room fire, and it undid him, and he crossed the little room at last, and she did not step back, and he took her cold hands in his exactly as he had knelt and taken them the night her father died, and this time she turned her hands within his and held on. "I cannot afford you," she whispered. "I never could, I never will." "Then let me pay," he said. "I have told you, I have money enough for us both." They were married in the spring, in the little church at Wexholt Magna where they had buried her father, a year almost to the day since a duke had first ridden down to a frozen mere and failed to fire. It was not a grand wedding. Half the county stayed pointedly away, and Julian found he did not care, and the half that came were the half that mattered, the cottagers whose roofs he had mended and whose school he had built and whose wages he had raised, the ploughmen and dairymaids and the widow from the Moor Stud, Mrs. Harbottle, who gave the bride away in the absence of any father, and Ottilie, who stood at her brother's side in the front pew in the finest gown she owned and looked, with magnificent challenge, at every empty place where a neighbor ought to have sat, and dared the whole absent county to matter. It did not matter. The little church was full of the people who loved them, and the spring light came in through the plain glass, and Nell Caro came up the aisle in a gown of simple white with a spray of real forget-me-nots at her breast. She had refused silk. She had always refused silk, and the Duke of Wexholt, watching her come, 41 years old and weeping without shame before his own tenants, thought that he had spent his whole life being told what his name was worth, and had learned at last that it was worth precisely this: the buying of one plain, honest woman's freedom to love him openly, in the light, before God and the people, with her pride intact, and her chin up, and no door in the world able to touch her now that she was his and he was hers. Lady Sybil Aldous did not come, of course. She had left the county before the winter was out, when the story of the still-room bribe leaked as such stories do, whatever cannot be proven in law, and made her name a byword in the very drawing-room she had thought to rule. She married in the end a gouty marquis twice her age in a distant shire, and got her grander coronet, and was, by every account that ever drifted north, perfectly and coldly miserable, mistress of a great house and of no single heart within it, which was the one estate she had never known how to want and could not now, having everything else, contrive to buy. Julian heard the news of her marriage without triumph and without much interest. She had been a hard, bright stone, and she had cut what she could reach, and she had reached, in the end, only the ordering of her own long chill of a life, and that was punishment enough, and none of his to administer. Mrs. Kell was turned off, but not prosecuted. Nell would not have it, and Nell was Duchess of Wexholt now, and her word carried, and the woman went south to her sisters and was heard of no more. The niece, who had wanted the dairy and been the innocent occasion of the whole plot, kept her place, for Nell said the girl had done nothing and should not suffer for an aunt's spite, and the county, hearing of it, was divided as ever between those who thought the new Duchess soft and those who thought her wise, and the wiser sort, as usual, had the right of it. They were happy. It is a small word for a large thing, and Julian, who had spent so much of his life at a loss for the true names of feelings, found that this one at least needed no elaborate naming. They were happy, plainly and daily and without ceasing. He did not become a comfortable man. He was too much marked by his years of cold for that, and there were still mornings when the old stiffness came over him and Nell would look at him across the breakfast table and say, dry as ever, that his Grace had put his ducal face on, and would his Grace kindly take it off again? And he would, and laugh, because she was the one soul on earth who had never once been afraid of him and never would be. The doors that had closed opened again, one by one, over the years, as doors do when the people behind them grow curious and then ashamed, and then quietly determined to have known better all along. And by the time the county came round entirely, the Duchess of Wexholt was so plainly and completely the mistress of her husband's happiness, and the good angel of his whole estate that no one who came to know her could remember, or would admit to remembering, that she had ever scoured a milk pail or sent back a hamper or walked out of a harvest supper alone into the dark. The orchard he had learned to prune came into its full bearing, and every autumn the whole estate came to gather it, masters and men together in the old way, and Julian would climb the trees still in his shirt-sleeves, a gray-haired Duke up an apple tree, while below him his wife directed the picking with her sleeves pushed to the elbow and her chin up, and a small hand or two clinging to her skirts for, in the fullness of time, the empty nursery at Wexholt Abbey filled. And Ottilie wept over the cradle and swore she had never doubted, and the dukedom passed, when its time came at last, not to card-cheating cousin Bertram, but to a dark-eyed boy who had his father's aristocratic features, and his mother's fearless way of speaking the truth to anyone, duke or dairymaid, who needed to hear it. And sometimes, on the soft evenings of early summer, when the work was done, the Duke and Duchess of Wexholt would walk down together through the walled garden and out along the ride to the frozen mere. Not frozen now, but green and still under the willows, and stand a while at the water's edge where it had all begun. And once or twice, across the years, they saw the Stag or its sons come down at dusk to drink, lifting a crowned head to look at them without fear across the quiet water before turning, unhurried, back into the green shadow of the high wood. And Julian would take his wife's hand, the reddened, capable, beloved hand that had scoured pails and gentled broken horses, and held her dying father's and been laid once, with its brooch, upon a barn's white cloth in refusal, and he would think that he had once stood at that water with a gun to his shoulder and a cold heart in his breast, certain he felt nothing that a man could put a name to, and that a slip of a girl in an ash-gray shawl had stepped out of the trees and refused to move, and had thereby saved not one life at that mere but two, the beast's and his own, and had gone on saving his patiently, plainly, without ever once being afraid of him for all the rest of his days. He never fired at a stag again. He never needed to. He had, in that one unfired shot, taken the only thing worth the taking, and he kept it and cherished it, and counted it, to the end of his long and happy life, the finest and the truest bargain that a proud man, humbled, had ever been fortunate enough to make.